The story of the Polish children in Isfahan, Iran, 1942-1944. During World War II, 1.5 million Polish people, ordinary men, women and children, were forcibly deported from their family homes in Poland and taken to labor camps in the Soviet Union, where they were to spend the rest of their lives in Siberia. Many died of illness and starvation. Many children became orphaned, lost, or separated from their families. After the agreement between Stalin and the Polish government in London, Polish people were permitted to leave the Soviet Union. Between the years of 1942 and 1944, over 120,000 Polish people found temporary refuge in the hospitable country of Iran, and for 3 years, up to 2,500 Polish children lived in the very beautiful city of Isfahan. To this day, the former Polish children remember and are very grateful for the warmth and kindness they experienced among the people of Iran. The following are photographs depicting the story of the Polish children in Isfahan. This DVD was compiled from the photographs which belonged to Madam Krystyna Skwarko, Director of Polish Schools in Isfahan, Iran, 1942-1944, by Krystyna Tomaszek, her daughter, and author of the book Essence. 7th of October, 1943. This is the commemorative plaque inside the French Sisters Chapel with the picture of the Polish Madonna of Częstochowa, placed on behalf of the Polish children as a thanksgiving for being rescued from the labor camps of the Soviet Union. The designer of the plaque was the artist-painter Mr. Nersesyan. Present at the unveiling was the Minister of Education. Polish children were always encouraged to ask God for blessings for Persian people who were so kind and friendly towards us. Polish girls and official guests gathered in front of the French Sisters Chapel. After the arrival in Isfahan, the children were divided into 3 groups. 100 girls from 7 years up were to stay with the French sisters. 100 boys of the same age were to stay with the Silesian brothers, and the youngest children were temporarily placed in the private home owned by an English couple, Mr. and Mrs. Edith. Here the girls are dressed in clothes made especially for them by the French sisters. At long last, the children had sunny rooms to live and study in, and clean beds to sleep in. The girls in Home 5, with the regional director, the director of the Polish schools in Isfahan, Mrs. Skwarko, and the director of Home 5. After staying at Home 2, I came to live in this home, situated in Char-Bar Avenue. My mother, Mrs. Krystyna Skwarko, who was responsible for bringing the first transport of the Polish children to Isfahan, my brother Stan, and I, Krystyna. This is me and my brother Stan in front of the Sisters' Chapel called Home 2. The convent was the most beautiful building, standing in a quadrangle with trees, flowers, and a decorative pool in the middle. The walls were covered with traditional Persian mosaics. There was also a large park-like garden on the other side of the chapel. Boys and the personnel in front of Home 1. Children studying in the garden of Home 1. School lessons commenced in all the homes on 10th of April, 1942, almost immediately after the children's arrival in Isfahan. It was hoped that beginning a normal life after the children's sufferings and the privations in the Soviet Union would help them recover their intellectual and psychological health. There were no school books in Polish language, so teachers taught from memory until the books were printed by the Polish army in Palestine. It was considered very important for the children to form good relationships with their teachers and carers. Afternoon rest was compulsory, with the children relaxing quietly on their beds. Every effort was made to ensure that the atmosphere in each home was warm, friendly, caring, and loving, to compensate the children as much as it was possible for the loss of their families. Children are learning to play with a ball. The ceremony of the children receiving their first Holy Communion. His Eminence, the papal delegate, Father Marina, the director of schools, Mrs. Kvarko, and the delegate, Mr. Domovsky. Traditional Persian carpets cover the ground according to the local custom. A group photo of the children who received their first Holy Communion. This occasion was the very first important ceremony celebrated by the Polish children in Isfahan. 15th of August 1942, the singing of the Polish church anthem during Mass celebrating the Polish National Day. All Polish national days were celebrated in Isfahan to encourage the children to become good Polish patriots. The Polish National Day concert. Home 1 was one of the largest homes and had the largest garden, so all the important occasions were celebrated here. Children and personnel gathered from all the homes to enjoy such happy occasions. Girl Guides at Home 9, instilling high ideals and principles of the Girl Guide and Boy Scout organization in young people was regarded as very important in teaching children their self-respect, pride, and confidence. Guide and Scout meetings and evening bonfires with songs, poems, and stories recited by children sitting around the fire were always looked forward to. The papal delegate, Archbishop Marina, Home 9. All visits of important guests were considered to contribute to children developing pride in being Polish. Mrs. Kvarko in the company of the girls and the personnel of Home 6. July 1943. Scout Jamboree in Home 9. The occasion was the blessing of Scout flags. Because of the hot climate, windows of the buildings were frequently hung with drapes or covered with beautifully carved lattice work to keep the inside cool and to protect against the sun. Celebrating the end of the school year, Home 12. In the first row are the Polish dignitaries from Tehran. By the end of 1944, there were up to 2,500 Polish children and 300 Polish personnel living in Polish children's homes in Isfahan. Polish government in exile in London paid for renting the buildings. Each home had its own director, teachers, mainly women because men were in the Polish army, carers, a nurse, an administrative and cooking and cleaning staff. One home served as a sanatorium for sickly children. Although the children were very weak after leaving the Soviet Union and died in their thousands, only 4 children died in Isfahan. The reason for this was the wonderful climate of the city, the care of the personnel, and the friendliness and kindness of the local population. Important guests from Tehran in Home 10. The Minister of Social Welfare and the Director of Schools, Mrs. Kvarko, holding a small child in her arms. All the children in the photograph were either orphans, their parents having had died in the Soviet labor camps, or became lost or separated from their families during the long train journeys. The parade on the occasion of the visit of the Minister of Social Welfare, Home 9. September 1942. The Minister of Social Welfare and Government Representative, Mr. Padera, and the Minister of Social Welfare, Mr. Stabursky, visit Home 9. The parade during the celebration of the National Day, the Miracle of Vistula, marching at the high school girls. Among the guests are the consul and other delegates of the British colony, the governor of Isfahan, and the guests from Tehran. Children sang songs, recited poems, and performed Polish national dances. Home 1. The continuation of the parade at Home 1. Mrs. Kvarko and Mr. Dmowski are among those present. The youngest children from Home 10, the kindergarten, are also taking part in the parade. Some parents, whose wives or husbands died in labor camps, brought their children to the Polish orphanages in the Soviet Union because they did not have the means of supporting them or because they themselves wanted to join the Polish army. Living in groups helped children develop a sense of belonging and reassurance because they all knew what it was like to experience war, hunger, and deprivation, and to lose one's parents. The personnel who looked after the children also had experienced life in the Soviet labor camps and lost members of their own families. They had their own personal unhappiness to cope with. In spite of that, however, all the adults did their best to help the children, and so the children and the adults found themselves helping each other. The Polish National Day concert. In the middle are the governor of Isfahan with the British consul, the bishop of the Anglican Church and his wife sitting on the governor's right, and members of the Polish delegatura sitting on the governor's left. July 1942. The visit of the governor of Isfahan to Home 6. Relationships between the Polish and the Persian community in Isfahan were extremely friendly and mutually beneficial. This was partly because of the very kind and positive attitude of the Persian people towards the Polish people, and also because local Persian community benefited financially from the presence of the Polish children staying in Isfahan. Various products had to be produced and delivered to the homes where children lived, and many articles such as furniture had to be manufactured. Many Isfahanis made enough profit to open their own shops and businesses in later years. The baptism ceremony of Mrs. Moravska's baby, Home 2. And the dignitaries and Mrs. Kvarko, Home 12. The dressmaking personnel, Home 6. And girl guides at Home 12. Colonel Ross, who was the public relations officer between the Polish and the British armies in Tehran, was one of the very important visitors to Isfahan, Home 1. Professor Koshawowski, with tourists, among them a Red Cross representative, on their way to visit Persepolis, Home 9. Professor Koshawowski visiting the kindergarten. Farewell to Mr. and Mrs. Dmowski, who were moving to Tehran. October 1942. The Polish personnel saying goodbye to Mr. and Mrs. Dmowski. The Minister of Education from Tehran visiting the museum in the company of the artist Mr. Nersesyan. Young women, members of the Polish Women's Army Force. Children dressed in Polish national costumes made by the personnel are waiting for the visit of important guests in Isfahan. His Excellency Archbishop Gawlina is carrying out the ceremony of confirmation of the children, and Mrs. Skwarko is the confirmation mother. A swimming lesson at the public pool in Isfahan. Sewing lesson. Children were given opportunity to acquire practical as well as academic skills. Here is the dressmaking personnel with Mrs. Skwarko and Mr. Dmowski. The exhibition of drawing by the Polish girls. Mr. Nersesyan, the teacher, is also present, together with the school inspector and the director of schools, Mrs. Skwarko. Art exhibition, students and the teacher, Mr. Nersesyan. It was considered very important for the Polish children to learn about Persian art. Presentation of prizes. Young women learning the art of Persian carpet making. Students were taught carpet making in the traditional Persian style, sitting on wooden boards covered with cushions, tying knots using short pieces of colorful wool, and copying designs of small design boards. Workers were supervised by the Polish personnel, but were taught carpet making by a professional Persian carpet maker. It was hoped that the young women would continue carpet making upon their return to Poland. 3 large 3 by 2 meters and 2 small carpets were made by the young Polish women in Isfahan. One of the large carpets was presented to the Shah of Persia as an expression of gratitude for Persian hospitality. One was presented to the Prime Minister of Britain, Mr. Churchill, and one was presented to General Sikorski, the Polish general and Prime Minister of Polish government in exile in London. Learning to understand Persian art was considered extremely important for the Polish children's future. Archbishop Marina and others are watching the young women making Persian carpets. Dignitaries from Tehran, the director of schools, Mrs. Skwarko, and the carpet makers. Home 17, a very proud moment, the display of one of the first Persian carpets made by the young Polish carpet makers, with the director of schools, Mrs. Skwarko, and other personnel. The Polish community in Isfahan deeply appreciated the privilege of being able to learn the skills of making traditional Persian carpets. The director of schools in Isfahan, Mrs. Kwarko, and the Polish carpet makers. Home 5. Visitors and personnel. Home 6. General Tokarzewski, representative of General Anders in the Middle East. General Tokarzewski visiting Home 15. General Tokarzewski visiting Home 6. General Tokarzewski and Colonel Borucki, the representative of General Sikorski, who, in 1942, signed the treaty with Stalin, allowing Polish people to leave Soviet prisons and labor camps in return for the Polish men and women forming the Polish army to help Soviets fight the Germans. 1943. General Tokarzewski, Home 9. General Tokarzewski and Colonel Borucki in Home 12, Julfa. General Tokarzewski with the youngest children in Home 10. The little ones are seen here crowding and hugging an important visitor. The general took them in his arms, but never asked the very obvious question, where are these children's parents? Benefiting from the wonderful living conditions in Isfahan, the children grew quickly and altered in their appearance. When some of the parents were finally able to leave the Soviet Union and have arrived in Isfahan to look for their children, they could not recognize them. Frequently, it was the children who recognized their parents first and ran up to them, calling Mama, Mama. Visiting the Ali Kapur Palace in Isfahan, the director of schools, Mrs. Kwarko, showing visitors around Isfahan. Visitors admiring the view from the terrace of the Ali Kapur Palace. The interesting carvings in the shape of various musical instruments carved in the walls of the Ali Kapur Palace. Visiting the Imam Mosque near the Ali Kapur Palace. At the other end of the Maidan is the beautiful bazaar stretching for many kilometers. Polish Army colonel from Iraq is visiting the personnel. The Minister of Social Welfare visiting Home 7. In 1944, girls from Home 7A and boys from the neighboring Home 7 formed a large proportion of the group of children who finally came to New Zealand in response to the invitation by the New Zealand Prime Minister, Mr. Peter Fraser. The children were to stay in New Zealand only until the end of the World War II and then return to Poland. However, after the war, Poland became one of the satellite countries of the Soviet Union, and the children and the personnel remained in New Zealand. In 1980, on the 35th anniversary of the Polish children's arrival in New Zealand, the Iranian government sent a film crew to New Zealand to film the anniversary celebrations. Tereshka is presenting flowers to the Minister of Social Welfare, Home 7. Students from Home 7. Mrs. Kwarko is sitting in the middle, and I am sitting on the ground, also in the middle. Home too. A small group of children and adults are saying goodbye to the commemorative plaque before leaving Isfahan for New Zealand. Every Polish child in Isfahan was given a supply card with the list of articles of clothing they were given before departure for New Zealand. When leaving Iran, children carried Polish books in their suitcases, together with their few personal possessions. Later, these books became the basis of the Polish Library, established in the capital city of New Zealand in Wellington. This is a document of identity possessed by every Polish child in Isfahan. The text of the card exalted the virtues of Polish patriotism and of Poland as our mother country.